Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep today, the learner. Really deep into some pretty foundational stuff about how economies, actually work. You guys sent us excerpts from Adam Smith's, the monumental The Wealth of Nations.
Right. It's a huge one.
It's a massive book, and to be honest, there's so much in it. We're just going to focus on kind of giving you a taste of book one and then really unpack the central themes of book two. We want to give you the key insights and connect all the dots, so that you can really grasp these big ideas without feeling totally overwhelmed, hopefully. So let's dive in.
I think what's always amazing to me is how much of what Smith wrote back in the 1700s still really applies to how we understand economies today. It's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah, for sure. Book one of The Wealth of Nations, it's really about setting the stage. It looks at what makes labor more productive, how we can produce more efficiently, and then also how all the stuff we produce gets divided up in society.
Like who gets what?
Exactly, who gets what. And there are some super interesting parts in there, like how dividing labor up into specialized tasks can dramatically increase output.
Oh yeah, that's the whole pin factory example, right?
Yeah, exactly. Where each person focuses on one tiny part of making a pin, and they end up making way more pins overall.
Way more efficient.
Way more efficient, yeah. And Smith also digs into the role of money, as that medium of exchange and the challenges that come with it. Like, before we had coins, can you imagine having to weigh out, gold and silver every time you wanted to buy something?
Oh man, the total nightmare.
Yeah, total nightmare. He even talks about early Roman and English currency and how that evolved.
That's right, yeah.
And then he goes into, what determines the prices of things, breaking it down into those three core components: wages, profit, and rent.
Right. The building blocks of cost.
Yeah, exactly. And we also get introduced to this concept of a natural price, which is kind of like this theoretical price point that market prices tend to gravitate towards.
It's like an equilibrium almost.
Yeah, exactly. So book one is really about laying out those fundamental elements. But then book two is where it gets really interesting, because that's where we start to see how wealth is actually built up, over time.
Yeah, it shifts the focus to the dynamics of growth and accumulation.
Right, exactly. If book one is a snapshot, book two is the whole movie.
I like that, yeah.
So book two is titled Of the Nature, Accumulation, and Employment of Stock. And it really zeroes in on this concept of stock, which is basically, all that accumulated wealth. It could be money, it could be goods, it could be, anything that has value.
Right, or even the tools and resources used to produce those goods.
Exactly. And the book delves into how that stock grows, the
Uh-huh.
various forms it can take, and crucially, how it's used to drive economic activity.
Like, how do you actually put that wealth to work to create more wealth?
Exactly. And this book is divided into 5 chapters, each one focusing on a different piece of that puzzle. So let's dive into those chapters, starting with chapter 1 of the division of stock.
Right, and right off the bat, Smith draws this really important distinction between how an individual can use their wealth. He introduces these two fundamental concepts: stock, reserved for immediate consumption, and capital.
Okay, so break that down for us.
All right, so the stock for immediate consumption is, well, pretty straightforward. It's like the food in your pantry, the clothes you wear, the furniture in your house.
The stuff we use every day.
Exactly. Things that satisfy our immediate needs and are gradually, well, consumed. On the other hand, capital is stock that's employed with the intention of generating more wealth, of making a profit.
So it's not just stuff you're using up. It's more like investing in the tools to create more stuff.
Precisely. Like the baker's oven we talked about earlier, or the shopkeeper's inventory of goods to sell.
Okay, that makes sense. But even capital isn't all one big lump, right?
You got it. Smith actually divides capital into 2 further categories:
Yeah.
fixed capital and circulating capital.
Okay, let's dig into those a little bit. What's fixed capital?
Fixed capital is basically anything that provides income or profit without actually changing hands or circulating. So things like the machinery in a factory, the farmer's tools, the businesses operate these, all fall under fixed capital.
Okay, so stuff that stays put but helps you make money. What about circulating capital then?
That's the stock that is constantly flowing, going out, and coming back into the owner's possession as part of the business process.
So more like liquid assets.
Yeah, you can think of it that way. It's things like the cash a business has on hand, the raw materials they buy to produce goods, and the finished goods they then sell to customers. All of these are constantly turning over.
So the money goes out to buy materials. The materials are used to make products. The products are sold for more money, and the cycle continues.
Exactly. And what's really insightful here is Smith's emphasis on circulating capital as the direct engine of revenue. While fixed capital is absolutely essential, it enables the work to be done. It's the continuous flow of circulating capital that actually creates the regular income for a business. Think back to the baker. The oven is the fixed capital, but it's the flour, the bread, the money from selling the bread that's the circulating capital that keeps the whole operation running.
Okay, so both types of capital work together, but they have distinct roles in the whole process of making money.
Precisely. And I think this distinction is still so relevant today when you think about how businesses manage their assets and investments. Understanding the difference between fixed and circulating capital and how they interact is crucial for any business, big or small.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, so moving on to chapter 2, and this one has a mouthful of a title. Of money considered as a particular branch of the general stock of the society, or of the expense of maintaining the national capital.
Phew, that's a long one. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it sets the stage for a really interesting argument. Smith acknowledges that money is a crucial part of a nation's circulating capital, but he then goes on to suggest that having too much money, specifically metallic money like gold and silver, can actually be a drag on a nation's economy.
Wait, so having too much money is a bad thing? That seems counterintuitive.
I know, right? This sounds a bit strange at first.
Yeah.
But remember, this is back when gold and silver were the primary forms of money. So think about it. If a nation is hoarding huge amounts of gold and silver, those precious metals are essentially locked up. They're not being used to produce anything or to facilitate trade as effectively as they could be.
Okay, so the wealth is just sitting there, not really doing anything productive.
Exactly. And not only that, but the whole process of acquiring and maintaining that gold and silver, mining it, refining it, minting it into coins, all of that requires resources and labor that could be used elsewhere.
Right, so those resources and that labor could be going towards producing other goods and services that people actually need.
Exactly. And the chapter makes this really interesting analogy. It compares money to tools or machinery. Both require an initial investment and ongoing upkeep. While they contribute to overall production, the cost of acquiring and maintaining them is a deduction from the net revenue.
So in a way, having too much gold and silver tied up as money is like having a bunch of fancy tools just sitting in your shed gathering dust instead of being used to build something.
Exactly. And that's why Smith starts to hint at the potential advantages of a more efficient system, like paper money, if it's properly managed, of course. The idea is that if paper money can effectively facilitate transactions, it can free up those precious metals for other, more directly productive uses.
So it's not just about having wealth, it's about how that wealth is used. And this really challenges that old mercantilist view that the more gold and silver a nation has, the richer it is.
Absolutely. It's a much more nuanced view of wealth
Hmm.
and how it contributes to a nation's prosperity. It's not just about hoarding precious metals, it's about using all resources, including money, in the most productive way possible.
This is really fascinating stuff. It makes you think about how our understanding of money and wealth has evolved since Smith's time, but also how some of these fundamental principles still hold true. Okay, so now let's move on to chapter 3. Of the accumulation of capital, or of productive and unproductive labor. This one really gets to the heart of how wealth grows over time.
Right, this chapter zeroes in on savings as the key driver of capital accumulation. The more people save and then invest those savings productively, the faster the overall capital stock of a nation will grow.
It's like the classic saying, it takes money to make money.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important distinction that Smith makes in this chapter, the difference between productive and unproductive labor.
Okay, this is one that I've always found a little bit tricky. So productive labor is basically any kind of work that directly results in producing a tangible, saleable good.
That's right. So you're thinking factory workers, farmers, craftspeople, anyone who is creating a physical product that can be sold. They're adding value to raw materials, transforming them into something new and useful.
Okay, so what about unproductive labor then? Does that mean people who don't produce physical goods?
Yeah, that's essentially it. Smith gives several examples. Menial servants, government officials, churchmen, lawyers, physicians, even performers like actors and musicians. Their work doesn't result in a tangible product that can be traded or stored.
But that doesn't mean those jobs aren't important,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. It's crucial to understand that unproductive in this context doesn't mean those professions are worthless or useless. They're clearly vital to society. A well-functioning legal system, a healthy population, access to education and entertainment, these are all essential for a thriving society.
Right, but their value is not directly reflected in the production of tangible, sellable goods.
Exactly. The distinction is purely economic. It's about how labor contributes to the accumulation of physical wealth. And Smith argues that a society where a larger proportion of the workforce is engaged in productive labor will tend to accumulate capital more rapidly.
So if more people are making things, more wealth is generated overall.
Precisely. And that wealth can then be reinvested, leading to further growth and development.
This is a really interesting point. It makes you think about the balance between different types of work in a society and how they contribute to overall economic well-being. So it's about more than just making stuff. It's about understanding how different types of work contribute to that process. Okay, let's move on to chapter 4 of Stock Lent at Interest. This one looks at the whole world of lending and borrowing.
Right. And it starts by clarifying something important. When someone lends out their stock, their wealth, and charges interest, they always consider that stock to be capital from their perspective. They're expecting it to return to them, along with a profit in the form of interest.
So it's like they're putting their money to work for them.
Exactly. Now, the borrower could do a couple of things with that borrowed stock. They can either use it as capital themselves, investing it in some kind of productive activity to generate their own profit, or they can use it for consumption, spending it on things that don't generate any future income.
So the borrower can either make the money grow or they can spend it.
Right. And the outcome of those two different choices is very different. If the borrowed money is invested as capital, the borrower can hopefully generate enough income to not only repay the loan, but also pay the interest.
But if they just spend the money, they'll have to find some other way to pay back the loan and the interest.
Exactly. And that's where things can get tricky because they might have to dip into other savings, sell assets, or even take out more loans.
So borrowing for investment can be a good thing, but borrowing for consumption can be a slippery slope.
That's the general idea. The chapter also touches on the question of interest rates and how they should be regulated. Smith argues that there should be some legal limit on interest rates, but that it shouldn't be too low.
Why not just set a really low interest rate so borrowing is cheap and easy?
Well, if the interest rate is set too low, lenders might be discouraged from lending at all. It wouldn't be worth their while, especially if there's any risk involved.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where lenders are willing to lend, but borrowers aren't being exploited.
Exactly. Smith suggests setting the legal limit slightly above the lowest market rate, so there's still an incentive for lending, but it's not excessively burdensome for borrowers.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, finally, let's talk about Chapter 5 of the different employments of capitals. This one explores how capital can be put to work in different sectors of the economy.
Right. And the main point here is that while all capital aims to support productive labor and generate wealth, the amount of labor it can employ and the value it adds can vary a lot depending on where it's invested.
So not all investments are created equal.
Exactly. Smith lays out 4 main categories of capital employment. The first is in procuring raw produce. This includes things like agriculture, mining, and fishing.
So basically getting the stuff from the earth that we need to make things.
Precisely. The second category is manufacturing, which is all about taking those raw materials and processing them into finished goods that can be used or consumed.
So the actual making of things.
Right. The third category is transporting those goods, both raw materials and finished products, from where they are plentiful to where they are needed. This includes things like wholesale trade, shipping, and logistics.
Getting the goods to the people who need them.
Exactly. And the fourth and final category is retail trade, which is all about breaking down those larger quantities of goods into smaller amounts that individual consumers can buy.
So your local grocery store, your clothing store, and so on.
Right. Now, what's interesting is that Smith proposes a kind of hierarchy for these different employments of capital. He argues that investing in agriculture is the most advantageous for a nation.
Okay, why is that?
Well, he sees agriculture as being the closest to the original source of all wealth, the land. It's the foundation of everything else. And he believes that investing in agriculture will generally lead to the greatest increase in a nation's wealth and support the largest number of productive laborers.
So it has the biggest ripple effect throughout the economy.
Right. After agriculture, he ranks manufacturing as the next most advantageous, followed by wholesale trade and then retail trade.
So the closer you are to the source of production, the better the investment. in his view.
That's the general idea. He believes that each stage, as you get further away from the initial production of raw materials, employs less productive labor for a given amount of capital. And he also touches on the complexities of international trade, suggesting that more direct trade routes are generally more beneficial than roundabout ones.
Okay, so that's a whirlwind tour of Book 2 of The Wealth of Nations. We've covered a lot of ground, from the different types of stock and capital to the role of money, the distinction between productive and unproductive labor, the dynamics of lending and borrowing, and the various ways capital can be employed.
And it all builds on those foundational concepts we touched on in Book 1, really starting to paint a more detailed picture of how economies function and grow.
So, the learner, think about these categories: fixed capital versus circulating capital, productive labor versus unproductive labor, and how they might apply to the world around you today. Think about the businesses you interact with, the products you buy, the investments you make. Do these distinctions from the 1700s still have relevance in the 21st century?
It's a fascinating question. And it's not just about applying these concepts to businesses and investments. Think about the ongoing debates around government spending, taxation, social welfare programs. All of these tie back to Smith's ideas about how wealth is created, accumulated, and distributed.
And it's not just about getting the right answers, it's about asking the right questions. What are the goals of economic policy? What kind of society do we want to create? How do we ensure that everyone benefits from economic growth? These are all questions that Smith was grappling with back in his day, and they're just as relevant now.
Absolutely. So, the learner, this is just the beginning of a much larger conversation. We've given you some of the key concepts and ideas from Book 2 of The Wealth of Nations, but there's so much more to explore. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And before you go, here's one final thought to ponder. In our modern economy, which is increasingly dominated by services and digital technology, how do these old distinctions between productive and unproductive labor and fixed and circulating capital really hold up? It's something to chew on.
It certainly is. Until next time.
Until next time.